Hi, I'm Bill, the Domestic Monk. Welcome back to another video, and thanks very much for watching. So I'm excited today to interview with John Stansifer. He's the author of a new book on Army Catholic Chaplain Emil Kapaun. The book is entitled No Bullet Got Me Yet. You can see John's got it up there for the screen. Father Kapaun is the most decorated chaplain in our nation's history. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor and is on the path to sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church, where he will likely become the patron saint of POWs and MIAs. John graciously sent me a copy of his book in digital format, and I couldn't read it fast enough. It's well written, it's well researched, and it not only gives you a thorough look into the life of Father Kapaun, but it lays out for us a lot of the military history surrounding the Korean War, which I didn't know anything about, or very little about. John, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with me today. Can you start by giving us a little background on you and what caused you to pursue this project?
I've always wanted to be a writer since probably college, and I quickly fell in love with movies and screenplays. And on top of that, I was also deep into history and English literature, and I majored in film, English, and history at Kansas University. I never graduated because I hated math and science so much. My dad was a history professor for 50 years at KU.
Wow.
And I also had a deep love for Kansas history. And so because I served in the National Guard and because I grew up on war movies, and I mean since childhood, I watched war movies on a little tiny TV in Lawrence, Kansas all the time. Tora, 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 The Great Escape, etc. And my neighbor, oddly enough, was a captain of the Battle of the Bulge. He was taken prisoner. His POW train was attacked by the Allies when they were being taken to the prison camp and blown off the tracks. He escaped again. He got recaptured. Just horrendous the Battle of the Bulge fascinated me from a kid because I was always reading World War II history. And so that led to when I discovered screenplays and movies, I was determined to write I wanted to write a great war movie because there's so many great stories there. And I always thought it would be World War II. So as in the introduction of the book, you'll see, when I simply saw the Medal of Honor ceremony for Kaupan on TV, I knew instantly. My jaw was on the floor. I was by myself. And I just happened to turn on the TV the moment that it started. I had never heard of Father Kapaun. My parents are from Wichita. My grandparents are from Wichita. And when Obama was giving the introductory speech in the history of Kaupan, and I heard he was from Pilsen, Kansas, in connection to Wichita, I was even more enthralled. And I was standing up, staring at the TV. I couldn't get close enough to the story. And I pointed at the screen and I said, I'm going to write a movie about that guy. That was God speaking to me in those terms. It was like Obama Father Kapaun through the TV, through Obama and the veterans that were in the ceremony were telling me this is a bigger story than people realize.
Wow. So how long ago was that, John?
April 11th, 2013.
2013. Wow.
You can see the ceremony. It's 20 minutes long. It's on YouTube.
I'll look for it.
I don't know if you've seen that yet.
I haven't. I will look for it for sure.
It's
just
the
other day I saw. Have you heard of Father Kapaun?
Of course.
Yeah, he was they just did a mass for him just 2 days ago. I saw that.
Oh yeah, I read there's a book about him called The Grunt Padre.
Yeah.
And his canonization has slowed for some reason. But
yeah.
I'm not going to explain the process for that.
It's tough to become a saint. It's tough to become a saint in the generation you're in. And I think we'll get into this with Father Kapaun later. Just people, contemporaries, who knows what it is, jealousy or whatever, but it takes some time. It takes distance for the clarity to come through. Time and distance.
Well, I'm a truth teller, and my suspicion is anti-American bias on the part of the church because there has been no male saints named in the history of the church.
Yeah.
And the first postulator for Father Kapaun was Andrea Ambrosi, who I met in Wichita, and who doesn't speak English, but I interviewed him. And I said, how come there's no American saints? And he goes, because you're a new country. And he laughed.
Well,
I was like,
you've got servant of God, Father Ryan down in Chattanooga, just south of me in Tennessee, and you've got Emil Kapaun and Father Capadano and Bishop Fulton Sheen. So there are a lot. They're knocking on the door. I mean, it's only a matter of time. This was predominantly a Protestant country. It was founded that way, but it's a rich Catholic history here, and it'll take time. I mean, if you look at some of the great saints, look at Damien of Molokai. I mean, it took him 100 years to get canonized, primarily because the church and the bishops that he worked for resented him. But this guy lived up with lepers and offered his life in service to them. And, eventually the church catches up. But anyways, enough about church politics. Who is Emil Kapaun? Where did he come from? How did he become the man that you were writing about?
It's a very fascinating story, and it has its origins, of course, in his parents, who were Czech Bohemian immigrants, and they came over to Kansas in the 1880s and settled right in the middle of Kansas. Pilsen is named after Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, and where he was born, his hometown, and that's where the church is, the St. John of Nepomucene Church, which is the steeple is 5 stories tall. You can see it from all over because it's just flat farmland. Wow. All around. Pilsen is not really a town; it's more of a village. There's no businesses or government or whatever. Marion, Kansas is about 3,000 people down the road, and he grew up a typical Kansas farm boy, with the difference being that the church was a major part of his life. And the church was founded by Czech Bohemians who spoke Bohemian language. So arguments occurred over the years, as you can imagine, as when are you going to just start speaking English?
Yeah.
And so from about the age of 7, Kapaun knew he wanted to be a priest or a missionary. Wow. And so his upbringing was typical for that region, fishing and hunting and raising animals and doing a lot of farm work. And he excelled in school, and he went early, probably into high school, and then quickly into a seminary right after that, and in St. Louis, as you well know. And he made a lot of class notes. So many notes exist, which I have copies of all of them. It's thousands of pages, that we actually want to do a book on his theology. When he's canonized, there'll be other books about him, including on theology. Yeah. The other typical thing about him that explains him more than anything else is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Every American was so, I wasn't even born back then, but anybody will tell you that, Pearl Harbor is what motivated the entire country to stop with the appeasement of Hitler and Japan. Yeah. And get with the program. And boy, howdy, did they produce, as you well know from history. Kapaun was ordained a priest in 1940. So December 1941 was soon after. He was already a pastor at Pilsen Church. He immediately wrote his bishop saying that he wanted to serve as a chaplain, which he has to have the bishop's permission. And then they have a military ordinance that brings in Catholic priests into the military archdiocese, and his bishop wouldn't let him. And so Kapaun was more than a bit frustrated serving in a very small town. It's just not a big parish, to be blunt. And so he repeatedly said, he feels the call of duty to his country and who he called his boys, the fellow soldiers, because there was men from his town, of course, that were going to war, and he was communicating with them by letters. These letters are in the book. He repeatedly wrote his bishop about, listen, these people need a Bohemian priest. All these people grew up with me. They know me. What's the problem in having somebody else come in and take my purpose and let me serve the country? Yeah. And so they allowed him to become an auxiliary chaplain at Harrington Air Base, which was right up the road from Pilsen. And that's where they trained all the bomber crews and flew the planes heavy bombers. And so that was quite an exciting time because those crews would train and test the new planes, many of which came from Wichita, and then they would go bomb Europe. And
Jeez.
so he was meeting all these airmen, and this was a volunteer position, so he wasn't technically military. So it doesn't count as service, but he is serving his country. He is serving the military in this auxiliary position capacity. And he did that for almost 2 years, which is right in the middle of the war. And then clearly, you can look at the dates of the letters. D-Day happened, June 6, 1944, and Kapaun said, "That's it. I have to be with the men overseas." And his bishop finally relented, which allowed him to go to Fort Wheeling, Massachusetts, to attend the basic training and what the early versions of what the chaplain school was. So he was commissioned second lieutenant in 1945 and sent to the CBI theater, which is China, Burma, India. He traveled tirelessly. A lot of people don't even understand what the CBI theater meant. It was a giant theater of war, as big as Europe was, but it was a different warfare because the Japanese had invaded so far into Asia that we were partners with the Chinese and operating troops in Burma, India, and China to try to, defeat the Japanese.
Wow.
So Kapaun didn't just serve as a chaplain with the men on the front lines because they weren't at battle at that point. They were cleaning up the mess left by the Japanese. So in that regard, Kapaun served more as a missionary, and he traveled thousands of miles by plane and by jeep in India and Burma, restoring missions. And he was fulfilling his dream of missionary work because he was restoring missions from other countries, including, Italian sisters and, various other countries represented.
Wow.
And there's one story that's in the book where he restored a mission. He simply looked up into the mountains and he saw a wisp of smoke, and he said, "Stop the jeep." He was with his driver, and they hiked through the jungle and found the wisp of smoke. And there's two Italian sisters. They didn't know if the war was over yet, and they said our mission was destroyed. And he told them, "Look, we're defeating the Japanese. You don't need to worry about them anymore." And so they said, "Well, we hid the vestments from the church and the mission in a cave in the mountains, and the cave entrance was so small they had to lower a little boy, a native boy, into the hole, and he came out with all the vestments from the church,
Wow.
and they put him in the jeep and they drove back to the mission, which had been desecrated, but it wasn't destroyed. The father had been killed or was disappeared by the Japanese, and they restored the mission. And Kapaun gave just a glorious sermon, homily at the celebrating the restoration of the mission. And one of the children said, "He speaks just like our father speaks." And he was referring to the father that had been kidnapped and killed by the Japanese. And then he collected several $1,000s from soldiers, and he gave it right to the mission to put them back on track. That's the most
That's
powerful story.
incredible.
And that's just of World War II. That's that. And so that's an example of
Yeah.
his leadership and his piousness and his need to serve God and
Yeah.
country, which is the motto of the Chaplain Corps, for God and country. And he did
Yeah.
that.
It's funny. He One thing about Father Kapaun that you notice throughout the book is that he wasn't content just to do the minimum or get by. He invested himself 100%. And even when he was doing all these other things, he was taking time to write his parents, to write his bishop, to write to other people, other soldiers. I mean, it was like the guy was going 24 hours a day.
He was always writing when he wasn't traveling, doing the duties. FDR passed away in, I believe, March or April of 1945, and he gave the homily, the what do you call the service for FDR in New Delhi, India, It was attended by 9,000 people.
Wow.
That's what a big figure, FDR was to the world, literally saving the world. And so to think that Kapaun had an audience of 9,000, which is about the same audience he had in the hockey arena where his own funeral services were held in Wichita, 80 years later.
Wow.
That's about the same amount of size of people. It's called Hartman Arena. It's a hockey arena in Wichita. That's where they held the service in 2021.
How long did he serve in World War II?
So he's 1945, 46, 1 year duty, and everybody was getting out of the army, as you well know.
Yeah.
Uh, so he didn't see the need to stay with the chaplain corps because it looked like, everything's going to get back to normal now. And so he returned and immediately was enrolled in Catholic University in D.C. In a very short period of time. He achieved a master's in education. He wrote about Catholic high schools, the need for more Catholic teachings in Catholic high schools. That's what his thesis was on. It's very specific and well detailed. He's a very eloquent writer, and he speaks 4 or 5 languages at this point. So
Wow.
he's a very learned person. He spoke German, Bohemian, English. He was learning Greek and, of course, Latin. And even later, when he went to Japan, he started studying Japanese. So once again, he achieved this master's, and he was requested to go back to the same parish in the middle of Kansas, another town called Timpkin. I mean, you could just know by the name, Timpkin's not going to be a very big town. And so he went back and forth between Timpkin and, of course, Pilsen, and again was starting to get restless. The world events clearly affected him. The Berlin airlift was around 1948, and you can see in his letters, he said, "We'll take care of Hitler. It's communism that you really need to be afraid of."
Yeah.
And he was quite accurate in that regard, and many people felt that way, of course. He felt there was so strong a threat that he should re-enlist in the military to serve the nation should the need arise for war could happen again. He was mainly referring to Europe, but trouble was already brewing in Korea because they hastily, 1948 was a pivotal year. That's when the UN was formed. They hastily drew a border at the 38th parallel to temporarily settle the country until unification. Russia hated the Japanese. They thought that Korea should be owned by them with China as a communist country, the whole peninsula. And so that led to the Civil War just beginning 1948. So Kapaun went to Fort Bliss, Texas in 1948. And then by the end of 1949, he had the last Christmas dinner with his family in Pilsen, Kansas. And he was sent to Japan January of 1950. So his visit to Pilsen was his last.
Wow.
Having no idea what was going to go on, that there was a massive amount of troops still in Japan for the occupation and the rebuilding of the country. And Douglas MacArthur was the supreme Allied commander, and he's the commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, which is on my hat here.
Yeah.
And that's the only time you can hear Kapaun's voice. He recorded 5 homilies, which are beautiful, for Armed Forces Radio Network, and you can find them on YouTube. It's just his voice. They're very powerful. He did
Wow.
one on his birthday, which was 420, and then there was rumblings about Korea, but no one realized that what was going to happen in June of 1950. They had about 100 Soviet-made T-34 tanks and 100,000 troops, and they just rolled right over Seoul, Korea, and the country went into a panic because they couldn't fight the tanks, and they got decimated, and they quickly pushed south so fast that the entire civilian population was fleeing to the Pusan perimeter, the very bottom, the tip of the peninsula. Truman, he did what was the right thing to do at the time. There was no official declaration of war against Korea. he thought to use the United Nations as the world's police, and he called it a police action, and amassed, a massive forces called the UN forces, the Eighth Army, and they quickly went in to try to stop him. The first troops in were annihilated, which Task Force Smith, which is they heavily underestimated the power of what North Korea was doing. But anyway,
Yeah.
so Kapaun landed as quickly as July 18th, 1950, with 10,000 men from the 1st Cavalry Division, and that began what they call the breakout of the Pusan perimeter, which took months. And then the Marines were coming in behind them. The Marines went up the right side. The Army went up the left side. And, well, the Korean War is it's just fascinating history. And then September 1950 was Douglas MacArthur's finest hour, probably, with the landing at Incheon. I mean, 50, 60,000 Marines cut the North Korean army in half. They retook Seoul, Korea, and that allowed the 1st Cav Division, as the tip of the spear, push all the way up to the border and await the orders. And then, it's just fascinating history going on. Truman and MacArthur met at Wake Island. They discussed using nukes against China. As MacArthur said, that's the only way you're going to end the war. Is literally, let's drop 4 nukes on China, and they had millions of troops amassing on the border, and I don't know why they didn't believe it. So it's a very quick history of 1950. It's one of the most brutal series of battles in the history of the United States military, as brutal as anything in the South Pacific. So
Yeah.
they pushed into North Korea. They took Seoul, Korea by October, on October 20th, 1950, without much of a fight, and they quickly built up thousands of troops there. Bob Hope showed up to do a show. That's a whole nother story about what Kaupan was doing in Korea, which was the opposite of Bob Hope.
Yeah. So
And then they
so
pushed
you
north,
mentioned.
and China entered the war, and MacArthur was caught off guard, and resorted back to saying we got to use nukes. And of course Truman, and this is, if you saw the movie Oppenheimer comes into Truman's office and says, I've got blood on my hands. I think I've made a big mistake making this giant bomb. And Truman kicked him out of the office and said, you're a wimp. I don't need this pansy talk going on. And
So
only a
basic.
couple, so my point is, a couple of years later, guess what happened?
Yeah.
Truman took Oppenheimer's words to heart, and he didn't use nukes himself
Yeah.
because he was afraid of the legacy that it would leave behind, that he left behind already with Hiroshima.
Well, so
Fascinating
getting back
history.
to Emil Kapaun, so there was, he kind of understood the big picture, and he didn't he expected the Chinese to get in the war, right? He was preparing for that, and when the
That's the
U.S.
story
troops
I
were
wanted to tell.
celebrating and they had the Bob Hope show, he actually had a mass instead, right?
And he convinced Bill Richardson to attend. Bill loved Father. He wasn't Catholic, but he saw something in his faith that really moved him, so much so that he told 8,000 people attended, 8,000 troops attended the Bob Hope show. 8,000 on, they landed right in the airfield, the most popular entertainer in the world. You could still hear artillery going off in the distance.
Wow.
And Kapaun had zero interest in it. And he told Bill Richardson and his men, well, I'm going to have a mass. Come if you want. I don't care if you're Protestant or Jewish or Catholic or whatever. He said that every time. He was an ecumenical minister in addition to being a Catholic priest, because he is a chaplain, which is why I just
Yeah.
have this renewed love of the Chaplain Corps. It's a fascinating organization,
Yeah.
which
That's
began
the
in,
spirit of chaplaincy. I'm a fire chaplain. I mean, that's, you're there to minister to the troops, and it doesn't matter what their faith is.
it's for morale.
Yep.
And that's what I have a chaplain's manual from World War II. It's just fascinating. It gives the history of the Chaplain Corps, which was started by General Washington in 1775, the same year as the Marine Corps. I mean, That's a fascinating history.
Yeah. So
And
he was at mass. What happens the very next day? The
the
Chinese.
next day, they all thought they were going home. They were talking about how to load a ship, that they were going to have parades in Tokyo and then back home in the States. And almost like on a dime, the order came down, uh, you're all going north. And
Wow.
they went too far north, too fast. It's like an exercise in Sun Tzu teaches in the art of war. You don't you don't go deep into enemy territory without the support and the backing. So that gave the comparison of the Battle of Wonsan to a very unfortunate comparison to the Battle of Little Bighorn and Custer's Last Stand. And that
Wow.
is what it became. They were routed, they were decimated, they were captured, killed. The wounded were even killed by the Chinese. It's one of the most god awful losses in military history that led to another title called the Lost Battalion. Nobody wants to be known as the Lost Battalion. That's the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. They
Wow.
were effectively done as a unit. They were gone.
So that was he. So he was captured after that Bob Hope show, and they pushed north. They were overwhelmed by the Chinese, and they were basically all taken captive at that time.
The Chinese they only had one strategy that was effective, and that's just you throw everybody in pell mell all over the place. Sometimes they didn't even have rifles. You're just supposed to pick up the rifle of your dead comrade
Wow.
and go right in. And if you take a bullet, that's you're doing it for Mao, and the next person comes in. Unfortunately, this led to at the Battle of Wonsan is the first clash between Chinese and American troops. People talk about the Chosin Reservoir battles all the time, and a lot of people think, well, only the Marines were in Korea because Chosin was such a major battle. But let me set the record straight, and I can safely say this as an amateur historian. These were not. This wasn't a battle; it was a campaign, which means the Chinese were hell bent on a second offensive against South Korea. They wanted to do the same thing that the North Koreans did, push us all the way back off the peninsula. So that's an offensive. It's not a battle, and they stocked troops the entire length of the freaking 900-mile border of the Yalu River, all crossed over there. And so the Battle of Wonsan, which I frequently say is the canary in the coal mine, when the Chinese overwhelmed the Americans, it emboldened them to keep going. And so could you imagine facing 3 Marine divisions in Chosin? They did the same thing. They just overwhelmed them with numbers. They had no air power.
Yeah.
Zero air power, none. And so they only attacked at night to avoid planes that couldn't see them. And so they retreated at dawn every time to a safe distance, and they set fires all over the place to put smoke in the air. And many of the troops didn't understand that they were surrounded. And so the battles were very confusing during Unsan, which was early November 1950 into December 1950, and which led to about 6,000 uh, Americans being captured. The story of the POWs is a must tell with the story of the Korean War. It's not just veteran stories because, as you see in the book, the POW camps were
Yeah, they
they
were
would have been more
atrocious.
brutal had the North Koreans run them, but the Chinese decided that they had some value as for negotiations. But even still, they didn't care to help them with simple things like uh, helping with illness and treating wounds. And so when they died, as Kapaun did, they they claimed it was natural causes every time.
So okay, a
It's
couple
an
of things.
atrocity that's not recognized as much as it should be.
Yeah. So what? So what was? So he gets captured. What was life like for them? I mean, that's where the story of Emil Kapaun takes root, right? That's where he became the man that we're recognizing today as a saint. What did he do that was so special there as a POW?
He stepped up more than any single individual probably did in the history of those POW camps. He stepped up. He was a leader. And this was so bad that they were with hundreds of POWs that if you got straggled or left behind, you were shot. And they all knew that. Some of them gave up on purpose, just they wanted to end it. Kapaun did
Wow.
all he could to carry Herb Miller, who he had just saved his life in the Battle of Wonsan. That's the predominant reason for the Medal of Honor, is the story of Herb Miller and others. And can you believe this? They got to the POW camp, which was a village that the Chinese took over. They kicked the residents out to say, hey, your town is a POW camp now. The day that they arrived, American B-24s firebombed it, blew it to pieces right in front of them. They were outside the town watching, cheering on the bombers as it turned into a fireball.
Wow.
And the Chinese, I mean, the Chinese guards, they were furious. I mean, what they could have killed all the POWs right there out of anger. And so what they decided to do was to move them south 12 miles to Sumbakal, which was a similar situation. It was a Japanese mining camp that they took over and turned into a POW camp. And it was night, and now it's getting into December. The winter of 1950-51 is the coldest winter on record. It went to 40 degrees below zero. They stole their boots and whatever, anyone that had winter jackets or winter clothing, it was gone. No blankets, no comfort, no ability to maintain, good fires in any room. So it's unfortunate, but the bombing of the first POW camp meant that more POWs died on a second death march now that they had to do south. And
Yeah.
Chaplain Hyslop couldn't take it, and he died in Father Kapaun's arms right when they reached what became later known as Father Kapaun's Valley. That's Sumbakal.
Wow.
Kapaun did his best to scratch a grave into the cold ground to give him a decent burial. And so where Kapaun stepped up is, it's confusing in the book, but he was in two POW camps. Sumbakal was the first one, and it's a valley that didn't get much sunlight because of the mountains. So you can imagine how cold it was.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just given birdseed every night. So December to January 1950 was absolute hell on earth. 50% of the POWs died. 80%, that's half.
Now he would go out and steal food and give it all away to the other soldiers.
He was Superman. I don't know how he did it. He he stole food. He went into fields to scrounge for if there was potatoes or anything that you could eat growing. He crossed the lines that he wasn't supposed to cross. They tried to separate, enlisted from officers, and he always started at 5 a.m. boiling water because he knew, and he would say, "Coffee, everyone." He bent some metal so that it would hold water, and they didn't have any utensils, no cups or whatever. So they had to make a cup that was shared by everybody out of bending the metal correctly so that it wouldn't leak, and also having some kind of pot to boil it. And they're just boiling snow, and that's the only water they had. And so he
Wow.
made it hot so that people felt like they were imagining hot coffee, and it cheered everybody up. And that's how he met Bill Funches. And Bill Funches said, "I hadn't had a drop of water in 2 months. That was the best coffee I ever drank, and it was just warm water."
There's a story too that I read. The gentleman who read or did the speech at his eulogy talked about a gentleman named Dick Hagen who had died while Father was out doing his errands. Tell us that story. That's fascinating.
Boy, that story is so fantastic. You'll notice my book is really an oral history. That means I'm letting the people that experience tell it in their
Yeah.
own words. Everything's in chronological order. Everything is true, and it's well sourced out. And so I bring this up because my primary source was Mike Dow. Mike Dow was a West Point graduate. He was captured after Kapaun. He was Catholic, and he was shared a hut with Kapaun until the end.
Is he the one that Emil Kapaun trained to do the mass when he was taken away?
No, that was Ralph Nardella, but I'm sure Mike Dow was there. So the reason I bring that up is because Mike Dow was with Dick Halpern. Halpern, I think, was in his unit when they were captured near Anjou on November 6th in a different battle after the Battle of Wonsan, which is its own stories. So Mike Dow's speech at the funeral services in Wichita, I'm telling you, it's one of the greatest speeches I ever heard. It's amazing.
Wow.
It's also on YouTube. It's on the Catholic Diocese YouTube channel, and that's
Okay.
Mike Dow. His speech he was afraid of getting COVID, so a West Point chaplain named Palatowski delivered Mike Dow's speech, and he had a great speaking voice. His speech was so good that I included it in its entirety in the afterwards of the book.
Yeah.
And so he tells the story of his buddy Halpern that just decided he couldn't make it, and when he feared it was the end, he said, "I've got to see Father. I've got to see Father." But Father Kapaun was already out on his rounds, giving prayers and picking other people's lice. I mean, washing their clothes. I mean, he was doing everything to help these people, these POWs live. And so Mike says that Halpern passed away, and soon after, Kapaun entered, and he said, Dick Halpern wants to see you. And, Father Kapaun didn't hesitate and draped him in his arms to administer last rites. And he supposedly drew breath again and was able to talk, to accept the last rites. And then he passed away, died a happy death, which is the whole journey of Catholics, is to die happy, knowing you're going to the kingdom of heaven. And so it's just one of those
That's it. That's
one of those death
unbelievable.
stories that just stuns the audience. They don't know what to say. It's so full of love more than it is violence. And it's yet another testament to why Father Kapaun is a saint. And I don't have to say that like he's officially a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. If you just look up the definition of a saint, he's doing all these things while he's alive, saving countless lives that otherwise would have been lost.
Yeah.
In many battles before the Battle of Wonsan and before the POW camps. I don't want to compare medals of honor, but Thomas Hudner was awarded the Medal of Honor when he's a Marine Corps pilot that got shot down, or his wingman got shot down. Jesse Brown, they made a book about it called Devotion. It became a movie recently too. And this was Jesse Brown was black and Hudner was white, and they were close friends, defending each other against racism before the Korean War. And when Jesse Brown got shot down, he guided him how to try to crash the plane so that he could survive. He couldn't see what happened to Jesse Brown, so he crashed his own Corsair to try to rescue Jesse Brown. He wasn't able to do it, and a helicopter extracted him and saved his life. Jesse Brown's body was never found. Thomas Hudner was awarded the Medal of Honor by Truman himself. Father Kapaun did virtually the exact same thing before the Battle of Wonsan. A F-50 behind enemy lines, and he rushed to it before the rest of his unit realized what was going on. He went by himself with a jeep. He didn't want to wait on his assistant, and he rescued the pilot's body out of the burning plane to administer last rites. And the plane was on fire, and ammo started exploding all over the place. And these are 50 caliber rounds. There's 6 50 caliber machine guns in the plane. So that's a lot of ammo. And after that, he pulled his body behind a berm and he came under enemy fire. And then his unit came up behind him and they fought back dropped mortar rounds toward the enemy that was shooting him, and they rescued Kapaun and the pilot's body, and that pilot was able to be sent home, and he's buried in St. Louis, Missouri. That is virtually the same as Hudner's. And again, I don't like comparing Medal of Honor stories, but
Yeah.
Kapaun did a similar thing, and in just one incident. And then, of course, he was awarded the Bronze Star for saving two other soldiers' life early on in the battles. His acts of heroism were numerous and witnessed.
One of the things that's causing his cause for sainthood to go forward is the fact that he offered his life essentially for
Yep.
his fellow POWs, and that resulted in his death. What were the circumstances there? Like it we, it was shrouded in mystery for quite a while, right? Like what happened? What did the Chinese do to him?
It's a very important distinction, and not everyone picks up on it in my book. In the book, I say repeatedly through his own letters and actual events, the Hill 303 massacre, and early on when they first got into battle, the first day, they witnessed a Jeep had been wrecked, been shot up, and four soldiers were killed, and their heads were chopped off by the axe that was on the Jeep. It was the North Koreans' way of displaying terror, to say this is what meets your fate if you keep pushing us in Korea. There's a reason I keep mentioning the atrocities of the North Koreans against civilians and against the military. As they retreated, they poisoned the water. They forced civilians into minefields to clear them for them to go through. Just, but when they captured troops, they were found hands bound behind their backs and executed, tortured, limbs cut off in just horrendous ways, as you can imagine. Many, many, many times, hundreds of soldiers this occurred to in the Army and the Marines. As I told you, the push north from Busan was very bloody. They kept getting overrun all the time. That's why there were so many POWs. And Kapaun writes to Father Gorosei, my purpose is to be here with the dead, and they're not taken prisoners. And he was witnessed 3 times carrying a rifle. And one of the soldiers, Bill Richardson, noticed that the rifle was inoperable. He probably found it on the ground, but he wanted to carry it to look like he was a soldier. And sure enough, he ends up capturing a North Korean soldier. Who did he surrender because of the cross on his helmet, or did he surrender because Kapaun had a carbine in his hand? It's we'll never know. The whole Kapaun is writing about this in multiple letters home, which you can see in the book, and then you see the reports from the war diary of the First Cav Division and the other letters and the other witnesses. They're not taking prisoners. It's kill or be killed. So my whole point of saying that is, as an offer of life, Father Kapaun knew unequivocally that when he surrendered at the CP full of wounded at the command post of the Battle of Wonsan, he certainly would have been expected to be shot. And he had to stand there as a witness as the Chinese walked around and shot wounded. They shot their own wounded that couldn't walk, and they shot uh, soldiers. Instead of allowing them to be POWs, they shot them on sight. Kapaun
Yeah,
must
if
have
they
been
fell back,
sick
they shot
to
him,
his
right?
stomach. He couldn't stand this going on. And they pulled Herb Miller out of a ditch with a badly wounded leg. And Kapaun had enough. And this Chinese soldier put a gun to his head and was a nanosecond away from executing him. Kapaun walks over, pushes the gun off of his head, and he simply tells Herb Miller, let me help you up. And he took him on his shoulder and walked him over to the line where the POWs were waiting to be marched out. And can you imagine, the Chinese were completely flabbergasted, but they were spooked by his piousness. And they wouldn't let him wear his helmet, but he was wearing the helmet liner, which also had a cross on it. And so the communist atheists were spooked by Christianity, spooked by it. the piousness frightened them because it had supernatural powers. And so Kapaun could have been killed and Herb Miller shot on the spot for doing that, and we wouldn't know his name today.
At the end of his life, his body broke down because of the lack of food, and he was always expending a lot of energy, and he ended up with a leg clot. Right?
A
Is that
very
at the point?
serious, a very serious clot that the doctors first thought to amputate it when it got really bad, but the Chinese wouldn't allow it, so they had no safe way of performing the amputation. So they treated him with in the hut with the warm bricks or whatever, and Mike Dow says he was getting better, but you
Wow.
know he also had pneumonia, malnutrition, probably dysentery, and so you're just getting weaker and weaker. Of course, when he probably weighed 100 pounds, maybe 90 pounds, and so the ability to keep that fight up, and that's you couldn't script a better ending to his life, which his last act on earth was to perform a sunrise service in the POW camp on the steps of the bombed out church in the POW camp, right in front of the guards, not allowed. And they were so spooked by it, they heckled him for a bit, but they didn't stop him. And there was about 100 officers attended the sunrise service. Could you imagine that? I mean, the witnesses said it's the most incredible Easter service you're ever going to hear is Easter 1951. And they sang America the Beautiful and other songs at the end so loudly that it carried down the valley, and the other prisoners heard it. And the POWs there said, we were singing so loud we wanted the Americans to hear it and come busting in with Sherman tanks.
Wow.
And that's
So is that when they decided to cut him out of the herd, so to speak?
they watched him intently. He collapsed out of sight at one point, and they put him in the hut. And the guards, they were well aware of him as what they called an instigator. They hated his inspiration that he was giving to the other men,
Yeah.
keeping them alive. They hated that. And when they realized that he couldn't walk, they finally burst in and said, he goes. We're going to take him to the hospital, which was really a death house. And it's the most incredible scene. Mike Dow was there and others. They tussled with the guards, wouldn't let him touch him. And Kapaun stopped him and just said the most beautiful things. He said, don't worry about me. I'm going to where I've always wanted to go. And he forgave the guards as they took him away.
Wow.
And there was a hospital with a ward, which they did, keep some people, I guess, who weren't so bad off. But if they wanted them, but there was a pagoda-like building, that also kind of bombed out, but used as it's disgusting. It's used as a morgue, but they put you in there when you're alive. And he passed away after about 2 or 3 days in there.
And then we don't know, that may have been the end of the story.
Yeah.
Except that we eventually were able to recover his remains, right?
It's you can't make this stuff up. This is why I'm so dedicated to the story, because I have to, there was a mass grave of probably about 1,000 POWs that died there. And I didn't realize the extent of the excavations that were allowed in 1954. I assumed that they didn't want excavations going on such a large scale. I didn't realize that they did offer this POW camp, which had so many remains. And so those 1,000 remains were excavated in 54, taken to Japan, and then to the Punch Bowl Hawaii National Cemetery for identification. But of course, no DNA. And so only a handful were identified through dental records and other things. The commies, man, they stole all the dog tags. If they had had the dog tags with them, probably every one of them would be identified to this day.
Yeah.
They took the dog tags off of the dead soldiers. I mean, it's another atrocity. And so Kapaun laid there from 1954 in a grave, in a coffin, interred in a giant cemetery in Hawaii with X2119, as his identifier. And he wasn't disinterred for DNA testing until 2019.
Yeah.
And it took 2 years to do triple testing. And before his brother passed away, he gave his DNA to the DOD, and that's what they positively identified as him. And
Wow.
he was 90% intact. But the story doesn't end there, because another soldier named Hansen was in Florida, in Tampa, probably over 90 years old, in 2021. And he goes to a doctor's office and he sees a Knights of Columbus magazine that has Father Kapaun on the cover. And he recognized the famous photo of Kapaun giving mass at the hood of a Jeep. He said, I know that guy. And he picks up the magazine and reads about it. And then he calls the Catholic Diocese of Wichita and said, I'm the one who buried Father Kapaun in the POW camp.
Wow.
You couldn't make this up. They immediately flew to him, the Wichita Diocese, and they interviewed him extensively, as I told you, as they do for the canonization cause. And he explained that only 2 soldiers, not Chinese, were allowed to pull the bodies out and bury them. Can you believe this? Hansen is not in the story. Before, he was unknown. Another soldier, maybe he was in the Marines, I'm not sure. And he comes out of the blue to say that we knew that Father Kapaun was special. Imagine thinking that in the midst of all this death in the POW camp in 1951. It's still pretty cold. This was May 1951. And so, for some reason, of 1,000 POWs, they buried Father Kapaun separately in like an independent grave that was not
Wow.
connected to the mass grave and deeper than usual.
Yeah. That's
And then,
remarkable.
but he was
Wow.
still recovered in the 1954 excavation. And Hansen passes away after he gives the interview, just like a couple months later.
That's
And so
incredible.
that's the story of how he got separated. So they describe his remains as 95% intact. Could you imagine
Wow.
that mass grave? You'll be lucky to have, you know, a certain percentage of your bones even left, you getting
Yeah.
mixed around like
Yeah. And
that,
they
because
got
you'd have
90.
to DNA test every bone in order to see who it identified with.
Yeah.
And the
That's a
DNA
remarkable
gets
story.
lost; it becomes dust soon. So they were
Yep.
able to drill into his teeth to get a good DNA extraction. And
God looks
so
after his saints.
this changed the course of the canonization, caused them to do an addendum to it, new information. And
Yep.
finally, they decided to seek martyrdom status, which had not been sought before, because they needed to know the manner of his death exactly,
Yeah.
which many veterans and people that love Kapaun are just, are you kidding me? You don't see the Chinese martyring him and his offer of life, fully expecting to be killed. Uh,
Yeah.
it's extraordinary. Author Jim DeFelice, my friend, he's the co-writer of American Snipers, one of the best-selling war books of all time, and a huge movie. He's Catholic, and before he even read my book, I showed him the screenplay, and he said, "This is the greatest war story of all time."
Yeah. It's
I
fantastic.
mean, that's
So,
that's a guy who's written 54 books and 16 war stories, and has 16 best-selling books telling that. And of course, that quote is on the back cover of the book, because it's just
yeah.
so powerful, because it's true.
John, it's an amazing story, and your book is an amazing book. You inserted letters and from people who actually knew Father Kapaun and served with him and were beneficiaries of his charity towards them, and,
Yep.
and despite the conditions. And I thought that's what made the book much more fascinating. It wasn't just, giving a third person narrative, but the people who actually served with him that said, look, this guy was something different. We were all in a war zone. Many people were not especially religious, but they came in contact with him and it changed their perspective, at least for the time that they were present with him. So that's remarkable. I hope people will take the opportunity to read the book because it's fantastic. Now you've got there is a feature film in the process. Is that what's going on next?
We're still in the development phase, unfortunately, but I have the we have a great director. His name is Stephen Campanelli. He's the camera operator for Clint Eastwood for the past 30 years.
Wow.
So he shot Letters from Iwo Jima. He shot Flags of Our Fathers. He shot American Sniper, and every Clint Eastwood movie for the last 30 years.
Wow.
He's directed 5 films himself. He's one of the most sought after camera operators in Hollywood. The screenplay mostly takes place in Korea because it's not a sweeping, boring biopic. That's more for documentaries than it is a
Yeah.
feature film. But it will be a true story, and that is
Well,
called Father Kapaun's Valley. I wrote that first, long before the book. I mean, years and years before. And
well,
I
that's
hope to.
outstanding. I wish you the best of luck with the book and the best of luck with the film. I hope it goes forward. I know I would love to see it. I thank you for taking the time and dedicating yourself to this project, because you've done a lot to help move this process forward and bring Father Kapaun's heroism and saintly life and actions to the world. So I thank you for that.
I haven't been able to make a website yet, but so I've just utilized Facebook, and so I have Facebook pages under the title of the book, and another one under the title of the book that's for media and for reviews and press on the book.
So that's
Both
No
of them are
Bullet
called
Got
No
Me
Bullet
Yet.
Got Me Yet. And then I
No
have
Bullet
another
Got
one
Me Yet
called
on
Father
Facebook.
Kapaun's Valley, which is for the movie. And then I have a John Stansifer authors page it's only there for for reviews and other stuff about the book.
Yep.
And my LinkedIn page under my name is also it's strictly about the book and nothing else.
I enjoyed the book. I very much enjoyed talking to you. I appreciate you coming on with me here and sharing the amazing story about Father Kapaun. And I wish you the best of luck going forward. I hope you have all the success with that movie. I look forward to seeing it.
Awesome.